watching BloombergQuint. Now we're still awaiting the outcome of the US presidential election. It's been a very, very tight race. But currently, as things stand, and litigation notwithstanding, the Biden-Harris ticket looks to be the closest to winning. If it does, how will that change America's relationship with the world and, of course, with India? I'm joined this evening by former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao. Ms. Rao, or Ambassador Rao, has also served as India's ambassador to the US, China, and Sri Lanka, amongst her other reputed assignments. Ambassador Rao, thank you so much for your time on BloombergQuint this evening.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Ambassador Rao, I know we don't have a conclusive outcome as yet, but so I'm going to, through the course of this interview, speak to you with regards to hypothetical situations. And the first one really is, just as I introduced, the point that it does look at this point that the Biden-Harris ticket is the closest to winning. Given the nature of this election, given the context and the environment in which this election has been fought, how different would the United States be under a Biden presidency?
First of all, I suppose the Biden-Harris ticket is slated to win. President Trump, of course, has mounted a legal opposition to the way the election and the electoral count has been going. To what extent that will succeed in a conservative-dominated Supreme Court, one cannot say at this moment. But what it tells you is that America is a polarized country today. Its society is deeply divided. And even if the Trump legal opposition or the campaign that he's mounted against the Biden vote gaining majority is concerned, even if that doesn't succeed and Mr. Joe Biden becomes the president of the United States, this polarization, this Trumpism, as somebody called it, this half of America being red is associated, as you know, the color associated with the Republican Party, that's not going to go away. Secondly, the Senate, which everybody expected would result, I mean, the election would result in a slight majority for the Democrats in the Senate. That too has not happened. So it's going to make the task of governance a little more difficult for Mr. Biden. And in many ways, it will confirm the deep polarization in American society. The third point is that his primary focus, President Biden's primary focus, will be institution rebuilding, will be a focus on the COVID-19 situation. It will be a focus on industrial policy, on jobs, on setting things, as he says, right, making them more stable, dealing with the chaos of the Trump years. All this, is what the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign has been saying. So turning to the external front, to the foreign policy front, foreign policy, of course, always follows suit after domestic policy. And the focus of Mr. Biden and the Biden administration will obviously be America as it exists inside America, dealing with the needs of the country as a result of all that we've seen in the last 4 years. When he turns his mind to foreign policy, and he will be a foreign policy president too, because he has vast experience in the field of foreign policy. He was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he spent long years in the Senate, and therefore he's very experienced and very knowledgeable when it comes to foreign policy issues. When it comes to India, when it comes to Pakistan, when it comes to our region, again, he's traveled widely in our part of the world. He knows the leaders, he knows the issues, and he knows the precepts and the direction of the US-India relationship. As you know, that relationship has thrived regardless of which administration is in power. So in many ways, it's a bipartisan consensus that exists within the United States about the India-U.S. relationship. And India is very favorably looked upon, I think, across the spectrum of public opinion also. It's seen as a democracy with which the U.S. shares many values, respect for pluralism, respect for diversity. And we have established a reputation for ourselves as a country that stands for a rule-based international order. And that especially applies to the Indo-Pacific region, which is what we call this confluence of the region of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So here again, there is a lot of strategic convergence with the United States. Mr. Joe Biden recognizes that, and I believe he will carry forward the trends, the positive trends in this relationship as established over the last few years. So in that sense, India should be in a good place, in a positive place. And it all boils down ultimately, I think, to the US-China relationship. That's really where the action is going to be. And that, again, is a field where in the United States, people are pretty united. In a very divided country, they are pretty united about the need to do something with regard to China that takes into account the fact that China has, in a sense, taken advantage of the United States over the last few decades. It's gained a lot from the relationship. It's given very little in return. And in fields like trade and technology, particularly, the US has very, very legitimate concerns, I believe, about the way China has gone about expropriating technology from the United States and building a comprehensive national strength on that basis. So that's really where the situation will be.
Well, that's a deeply insightful overview, and thank you for that. I want to ask you a few granular questions. The US under President Trump was considered by many to have become a bit inward-looking. Its participation in multilateral international organizations, its view of trade treaties, all of that had changed quite dramatically, from, let's say, President Obama's time, or even the years before that. Do you see any reversals in that under, say, a President Biden?
Yes, I think one hallmark of the Trump presidency or the Trump era was that he didn't play by any rules. Secondly, he was very transactional. And thirdly, he was very impulse driven. You look at his policy with regard to North Korea, the so-called love letters to Kim Jong-un. You look at the China policy, which again was quite impulse driven, although taking advantage of the domestic unease within the United States with China. You look at the way he exited the JCPOA with Iran. Of course, there were issues concerning the nuclear deal with Iran, but he's destroyed that completely. And I don't know if Mr. Biden can put together those pieces again. So that he did develop new linkages between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. And that again was with a domestic audience, very much a domestic audience in mind. I think he literally threw the Palestinians under the bus also when he concluded that agreement. So all this is what Mr. Biden is inheriting. And, will there be less transactionalism, which was your question? I believe Mr. Biden and the team that he'll put together will respect institutions, will respect the overall overarching interests of strategic convergence, the fact that, like for a country like India, there are these democratic values that bring the United States and India together and therefore should really define this relationship, and that too much transactionalism can be a bad thing. Of course, in trade, there will always be discussions about gaining advantage. I remember even in the Obama years, there were issues on concerns on the trade front, but we dealt with them, I believe, in a well-considered manner and without letting these differences overcome the common ground that existed between our two countries as countries with a very substantive and indispensable partnership, as they called it. Today, we call this relationship a comprehensive strategic global partnership. And I don't believe that definition will go away. even with the Biden administration taking the seat in the White House. That will not go away, but there will be a little adjustments. There will be a little more accommodation, and I'm sure he will pay attention to rebuilding, as it were, the State Department, which has been quite decimated in these Trump years. So that respect for institutions, having more experts come in, having less ideology, less transactionalism, that certainly will help.
But as you pointed out, ma'am, I think President Trump played to a more domestic audience in most of his policy making. Some of it was unpredictable, whether it was his decision to withdraw from the WHO or what he did with Israel in the Middle East to some extent. I'm wondering if the years, and I'm putting this very simplistically, you'll put it in far more diplomatic language, but if the years of America being this superpower, this intervener in important issues across the world, of being a leader. For instance, one of the things we've noticed even in the COVID crisis is that it's been a crisis without a global leader. Pretty much every country has dealt with this in their own way, on their own terms.
Yeah.
It did seem for the last 3-4 years that we were a leaderless world. Will that change at all under a President Biden if that were to happen? Or will those years of America being this intervening superpower, are those behind us?
Well, yes, there is change. And it's not going to be just a post 9/11 world, where America had decided to intervene. You had the disastrous Iraq involvement. Afghanistan has become a forever war. 18 years, unrest has continued there. Mr. Trump has announced that there will be a withdrawal of all American troops from Afghanistan. I don't believe Mr. Biden will reverse that. So, because in some senses, foreign policy also has to be sensitive to the mood within the country and how the people feel about it. So I don't believe there will be any conscious move to assert American interventionism in any crisis situation that happens. I think there will be more of an inclination to involve allies, to involve like-minded countries. So he will pay attention to the relationship with the allies. Of course, America has always been asking its allies in Europe or in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea, to contribute more to the support of the alliance relationship. That's not a demand that only Mr. Trump made. It's a request or an interest or an ask that the Americans have been making for a long time. But Mr. Trump, I think, articulated it in a way that one and more adversaries or friends became, turned off, let's say, by that relationship, by that attitude. So Mr. Biden, I think, will seek to make some accommodation and he will look at mending those relationships, definitely. But America, in the Trump years, the impression that gained ground was that America was in decline, that it was retrenching, it was no longer the global hyperpower that it had been since 1945, because even during the Cold War, I think it was the dominant power, even if, the Soviet Union and the U.S. were arraigned against each other. So, when Mr. Biden says he will make America great again, it's a different, he's not echoing the Trump, homily or slogan. I think what he means to say is that America is in a sense meant to be that exceptional country. And if you are, witnessing the end of American exceptionalism, as many people are saying as a result of the Trump years, I think Mr. Biden, with his foreign policy experience and his international exposure, will try and address, that concern that American exceptionalism is on the wane, because the very idea of America is built on the idea of American exceptionalism. So I think he will try to do it in a way that he will mend relations on the multilateral front, for instance, because America, again, when it comes to global government, when it comes to cooperation among nations, it in many ways led the way. If you look at the Atlantic Charter that was articulated during the World War, and the ideas of freedom, of human rights, of a rules-based order, all that comes from that period and has sustained the global order all these years. Now, if you have a China that is on the rise and that is seeking to put its own ideological caste, as it were, in defining what a world order should be, there will be every need, I believe, for, if you have to build resistance against that, for some of these values to be reaffirmed. The values that have sustained the global order and have sustained multilateral institutions, that have promoted climate change, sustainable development, all that I believe he will seek to address and to signal to the world that America does believe in multilateralism, and particularly on climate change, I think, which is a crisis that all of us together on the planet will have to address. I think you will find the US coming back into the fold, as it were.
It's interesting you say that, because I think every position that the US has vacated over the last 5 or 6 years, China has successfully or otherwise attempted to fill that position from a global leadership point of view, including on climate action, some of the pronouncements that they have made. Now, I understand that the America-China relationship will be adversarial irrespective of who takes White House. But do you think it might be a softer relationship, or at least China will perceive it to be that way if it were to be a President Biden? And if that were the case, then what are the implications of India, given our very tenuous situation right now?
As I said, the relationship, the adversarial content of the relationship with China will not dissipate.
Right.
The US-China relationship. But I don't think a Secretary of State under the Biden administration is going to say that, we have an axe to grind, as it were, with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they don't talk about the People's Republic of China or the government or sovereign government of China anymore. They just talk about the Chinese Communist Party. And they're, short of saying they want regime change in China, they're saying everything. Now, that doesn't really make for sustainable diplomacy. That is a road to confrontation and conflict, and trying to herd other countries together behind the United States in order to take on China. Now, that cannot be the route that, for instance, India, we have a land border with China. We have a problem, an unresolved boundary problem with China that has flared up the last 5-6 months. We have close confrontation along the line of actual control. We need to diffuse that situation without giving away our land or giving away our territory. So it's quite a challenge that we face. The US has said they will support us in this struggle against China. What exactly that support translates into, we really cannot say, because ultimately these battles have to be fought on our own. But maybe it will be in terms of intelligence support, maybe it will be in terms of military equipment and improving our capacity to take on the Chinese. Maybe it could, it all amounts to the defense and security relationship, the agreements that we signed, like Becca last week when Secretary Pompeo was there. So that cements the relationship with the United States, no doubt. And we should take strength from that, because now with the crisis that we are facing with China, there is very little questioning, I think, within the public space in India on whether we should draw so close to the United States or whether it's in our interest to be close to the Americans. I think those questions have become, much more moderated, much less heard today. People understand that in this very new world that we're faced with the rise of a very powerful, assertive China, we have to make adjustments also in our relationships with other countries in order to build that external balancing that we need against China. So that will continue from our side, and I believe the Biden administration also will be responsive to our needs in that context.
But I suppose what you're saying is that it will not make any material change in our current engagement with China or disengagement or confrontation with China. It cannot make any material change because this is too local an issue. Is that how one should understand it?
I wouldn't call it a local issue when India and China confront each other, and when there is the danger of conflict between India and China. It can never be a local issue because that challenge will run across the spine of Asia, as Jawaharlal Nehru said long ago. This is a challenge that runs across the spine of Asia. It will reverberate in the neighborhood. It will have repercussions for the region. Therefore, the world will be interested in what goes on here. It's not a local, tussle that India and China are engaged in. Maybe, ultimately it translates into these two big Asian giants rubbing up against each other. And it could be a struggle. It's an adversarial relationship that may continue, for years. It may not just be resolved short of conflict. I'm saying this adversarial relationship could continue for years until, we're able to solve the boundary question between our two countries, and until, China and India are able to address the concerns that each have about this relationship. So that's not going to go away so easily. But the Americans, I believe, would stay involved in the region. They would be, they would not. They being friends and partners of India makes them parties with a special interest, let's say, in this relationship between India and China. And given the fact also that the US-China relationship has been going south and there are many, many tensions. So things like the quadrilateral security dialogue, for instance, things like the concerns on technology vis-a-vis China, the concerns about the way China has used its relationship with the United States to gain strategic advantage for itself in the field of technology, for instance. All those concerns will continue, and we will have to address them. So like-minded countries in our region and the United States will have to, work with each other in order to build a strategic plan to address all these concerns, not just, border issues with China, but also the issue of technology, the issue of supply chain resilience, the issue of how we're able to build that balance and equilibrium vis-a-vis China.
But it doesn't strengthen our hand in any way. I'm trying to sort of square, a very muscular President Trump with a softer President Biden, but a non-interventionist President Trump with a probably more interventionist President Biden, and trying to understand if that gives us any advantage whatsoever in our current standoff with China. Is there a short answer in life to that at all?
I think the primary advantage lies in the strength of the India-U.S. relationship and the stability that you see there, and the resilience. Every relationship, if it has to be a long-term relationship, if it has to be a relationship that matters and makes a difference, it has to have resilience. And I think what the achievement in our foreign policy over the last decade and a half, together with the interest and the involvement of the United States, has been to demonstrate that we have built this resilience in the relationship. And that sends signals to China too. It sends signals. The Chinese are constantly commenting on anything we do with the United States. They're insecure about it, obviously. They are uncomfortable about it. So I think that puts the Americans and us in a good place, isn't it, as Chinese discomfort grows.
So I do know that Prime Minister Modi, has worked with President Obama. He had a very special rapport with President Trump. Howdy Modi is probably the best way to describe the camaraderie in that relationship. I'm wondering how you see that relationship evolve. I understand the broader context of the friendship between the two countries is on a smooth trajectory, and that's not going to change. But the personal equation between leaders also matters. And how do you see, therefore, Prime Minister Modi taking to President Biden? It won't be the same camaraderie that he shared with President Trump, will it?
No, why not? I've seen the camaraderie that President Obama and Prime Minister Modi shared. And of course, you mentioned Howdy Modi. I have seen Vice President Biden I have interacted with him when I was ambassador. I accompanied him to India when he made a visit in the summer of 2013. And he's extremely convivial. He's a people person. He loves, interacting with the politicians, just as seasoned politicians are, and Mr. Modi is in the same category of persons who is has long experience in the field of politics, and I believe that the two should relate well to each other. I mean, it'll take a little time, obviously, to build up the camaraderie, like with any relationship. But I'm sure that is not going to be an obstacle. The person-to-person relationship will flourish. I'm sure about it.
I have one final question, and that's the Kamala Harris factor. I understand that vice presidents have a more limited role when it comes to relationships with other countries. So, as you've just pointed out, Vice President Biden did visit India as well. But this is a very interesting angle, right, to the India relationship. She's also very forthright, very clear in the way she views many situations. I think she's made some very preemptive comments earlier on, on Kashmir or situations like that with regards to human rights in other countries, including in India. So I wonder how you see that play into the mix.
When you assume positions of responsibility as the head of government or head of state, it's very, very different. It's not, you cannot just graft a situation that obtained when X or Y was out of power. But, a public figure commenting on issues and certain, topics of concern to them. Be that as it may, once they assume positions of responsibility within the executive of a country, within the government of a country, I think it's natural that they will take into account all the, the interests and the fundamental security and strategic concerns that define the outlook to India. I'm sure that, it's not a simple case of I said this 2 years ago and I'm going to say the same thing today, because, with that kind of responsibility and with that kind of power, there always, as they say, there is a lot of responsibility, and you have to, weigh your attitudes much more carefully. And as I said, the strategic convergence with India is not going to go away. And the other thing I'd like to say is that between friends, it's not that we will always agree with everything that the other person says. I mean, it happens in human relationships, that. I mean, you can't agree with everything your friend says or does. But at the same time, the friendship is maintained, it flourishes because, you understand the importance of this relationship and why you need to nurture it and why you need to sustain it. And I think that will be the approach of the Biden administration. And if there is criticism, and if there is, if there is the occasional expression of some concern or the other, we should be able to address those concerns to them, not be able to take them on that. It shouldn't just be a cause for alienation in the relationship, unless it goes beyond a point and, it's difficult to control that. But I don't believe you will see that kind of situation. I think there will be a healthy dialogue between the two countries as grown-ups, mature grown-ups, and we should take strength from that.
Ambassador Rao, appreciate you sharing your insights today. As we pointed out right at the beginning of this conversation, we don't yet have an elected US president. The count is still going on. We do expect the Biden-Harris ticket is the closest to victory at this point in time, but there could be litigation and there could be a very, very different outcome. But we know what the relationship would be like under President Trump. We've seen it over the last 5 years. You've thrown great light on what it would look like if the Biden-Harris ticket were to win. And thank you very much for that this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Thank you.